Okay, so let's start thinking about this idea of the story world coming first and the medium second. So, with Harry Potter, the first thing we had, of course, was the novels, but the story itself existed, of course, in J.K. Rowling's imagination first and foremost. And then she wrote it, produced 7 novels, and then, we've, of course, had further spin offs from that. But we then, after the novels came out, we then had films that started to appear. And the films are pretty much a straightforward recreation of what we read in the books, and they don't tend to depart too much from the books. So we could say that that's very much the sign of a franchise, and we'll come on to that in a moment. We also had, at the beginning, we had video games coming out of the Harry Potter story. And again, they were very much following exactly how the novels went, and the same sort of elements. And you could be Harry Potter, you could go to Diagon Alley and pick out your wand and so on. And essentially nothing further was added to that original story world that J.K. Rowling had written about in the books. And of course, then we start to get more. So it's not just the original story world of the books, and then the films, and then the video game. Then we start to get things like the website. And the website of Pottermore is where this changes from being a straightforward franchise that just repeats the original story in different media, and instead becomes a transmedia storytelling experience, because you can get more from the website than is in the original books. So the story world begins to exist on its own and isn't just reliant on that original media of the book. And we also get things like a board game. And, this is broadly still part of a franchise because there isn't anything really new in the board game. But there are other elements, as I say, like the website, that actually allows there to be more going on. And this is the stage show, I think, of The Cursed Child. So, again, that is more than the original story world that we had, or rather, it's an extending of that story world. So it's not the same story being repeated again and again. And that essentially, we will come on to this notion of the difference between a franchise and a transmedial experience. But a franchise is essentially repeating the same story, just in different formats, in different media. But what happened with Harry Potter is that it went beyond that just simple repetition, and instead it was the story world itself that got extended. And that has also happened with things like fan fiction and fan sites, and other different entertainment forms like stage shows. And of course, even an experience, the Harry Potter world, where you can go and you can get to be part of, Hogwarts, and sort of experience that world as a sort of a theme park. So that, to some extent, is about the franchise, because I've not been to the Harry Potter world. If any of you have been, perhaps you can tell us whether there is an expansion of the story world. Are there things in the Harry Potter experience that don't feature in the novels? Are there additional things that perhaps don't feature in any of the other forms that retell this story? And instead of just retelling, does this expand the story? Because that's what's key. If it's a true transmedia storytelling experience, it expands the story world. It doesn't simply retell. And of course, there is a Harry Potter cafe in Japan. But again, does that just retell, or does it expand? It certainly expands our experiences in different media, but if it's just retelling the original story, then there's nothing really new going on. That's franchise and not transmedia. So, transmedia storytelling, as this infographic shows you here, it's reliant upon the original text, the original story world, and most transmedia storytelling does actually start with a text that is the sort of the discourse world, the original start, but it is beyond that. It's actually, you know, more about expanding that story world. And if we've got true transmedia storytelling, what we'll actually see is, instead of all of these other different forms of TV, the media, the press media, videos, interviews and role plays, analytics, mobile, and so on, all of those things, instead of all of those things simply repeating the same story, if they extend it and give us something new. So if, for example, we had a Twitter account or an Instagram account or some form of social media that had something more that wasn't in the original story, but actually allowed us to expand that original story and imagine maybe how our characters actually operated on social media, and that then enriched that original story, then that becomes transmedia storytelling and not just a franchise that is just repetition of the same basic story. So this is a definition of transmedia storytelling from Henry Jenkins, who is probably one of the key scholars on this notion of transmedia storytelling and sort of contemporary cultural studies. Henry Jenkins looks an awful lot at fan fiction and the whole notion of fandom and, you know, video games and, you know, transmedia storytelling. So he says that transmedia storytelling represents a process. So this is the important bit. It's a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. And ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. In other words, the story isn't just entirely housed in a single text or in a single film or in any other media. It's not just there. Instead, what happens is that we get part of the story, maybe from the Instagram account, maybe we get another part of the story from the novel, maybe the film gives us something different. So, you know, you see that the story world still hangs together. So it's not that, as we see quite often when films are an adaptation of a novel, and it is just that, an adaptation, and they perhaps change things that go against what was in the novel. We're not talking about that. It's not about adaptations that don't match. It's about a film perhaps giving us something more, additional stuff that wasn't in the novel, and it's additional stuff that allows us to extend this elements of the fiction. So it's absolutely having multiple delivery, so, you know, different forms of media telling the story and not it just being completely housed in the original text. So we could plan out how we were going to tell a story. And in fact, this is exactly what this particular template is for. So for those of you that fancy writing some transmedial stories, you know, this is a really good way of actually thinking in a far more global form about how you might actually tell a story through multiple different media forms, multiple different channels. So as it says there, you can have fictional websites for your stories. You know, you can have parts of it on YouTube, parts of it in video games, and, you know, it just expands. And a lot of this, if you think about how many TV and film and novels and video games are told these days, we actually have far more of this going on. You know, there is far more to an awful lot of really well established stories than just the original book or the TV show or the film. You know, instead, the creators, the producers have realised that actually we can tell this story in multiple different channels, not just in a single one. And what that means is that you really build up a um, a really good fan base, and the brand itself actually gets to be extremely well known, and it becomes it develops a fandom, a real fan base who really want to interact with it and want to be able um, to have more of the story because the story is perhaps so well loved. So it's definitely a new way of looking at franchises. So, as it says in this sort of quite simple diagram, originally the way things that used to work with traditional media franchises is that you would have the film, the game, the book, and those would quite often stand separately. They would be the same retelling of the same story, but they wouldn't really be actually, they wouldn't fit together. So this would be where you've perhaps read the book and then you go and watch the film, and the film is ultimately disappointing because it doesn't tell the story properly. It perhaps misses some things out, maybe gets other things wrong, and doesn't actually enrich the original story. And likewise, the game is just like an interactive movie. It allows you to, run around and perhaps pretend that you are Indiana Jones, for example. So you get to do the same things that he did in the film, running away from giant boulders and stuff like that. But there is nothing really new in it. It's just a retelling. And that means that, those three elements of movie, game, and book together just really aren't satisfying. They're just the same thing over again. Now, what we're getting with this move to a transmedia storytelling is that actually those three elements of movie, game, and book begin to lock together properly. And it means that actually the viewer, the audience, us, we get to have a far more satisfactory experience because we're getting something different from the book to the movie to the game, and then perhaps additional channels as well, like social media. There is something more. And this is where, we perhaps go looking for things like Easter eggs. That originally, Easter eggs, for those of you that don't know what an Easter egg is, I'm not just talking about, the chocolate that you get in at springtime. But this idea of an Easter egg is something hidden, and it used to be hidden within games, within video games, and the people began to find them, to discover these little elements that weren't perhaps a big deal, but they perhaps gave you something extra. So, in a lot of video games, early Easter eggs would be things like an additional life that you could find, something like that, or, an extra power up. But now that notion of an Easter egg is something where you get them quite often in films where there might be an insider joke, and it's only really the people who have read the book or played the game or know something more about this particular story and story world that get these Easter eggs, if you like. And sometimes it can be things like a reference back to maybe the actors that played similar parts in other films or actors who are in the film that you're watching but played a different part in something that they're really well known for, and there's some sort of insider joke to it. They're often referred to as being like Easter eggs, something additional that actually makes it quite satisfying for you. And particularly with transmedia storytelling, it's about this story world being expanded, and it makes it really quite satisfying because you want to find all the pieces and get the whole. So, how can we tell if something is properly transmedia storytelling or whether it's just a franchise? So, we've got this diagram here from Steve Peters, and he sort of goes through it to explain that, is it just the story? Are there other things? Do the fragments link together and so on? But essentially, the key here to remember is if it is the same story being told in one form again and again, so, if it is the story that's in the book that then gets told in a film and then is retold in a game, and they are all the same thing, it's not transmedial. It's actually a franchise. So, and if it's only on one platform, if it's just a book, then certainly that's not transmedia. So we can look at things like the whole Marvel universe and work out whether that's truly a franchise or whether it is properly transmedia storytelling. And, again, is it the case that we are getting the same story that was in the original comics? Is that just being retold in a different format, whether it's film or TV? Or are we getting something additional? Is there something extra going on here? So we'll take a break there. And what I'd like you to do during this break is to actually have a think about some different, really well-known franchises and work out whether they are true franchises or whether they are actually transmedia storytelling. And essentially, here is the key. Is there something additional in the different media that we're being told? Do they all lock together? So it's not that the TV show goes against the book or the comic, but actually it keeps to that original canon and expands it. So, that's the thing. You don't want to see them sort of going against one another. You want to see an expansion. Okay, and we'll come back in a few minutes.